Chinese trade officials announced an investigation into whether U.S. sorghum has been exported to China at improperly low prices. Is this probe the latest development in a looming trade war between the two countries? And two German think tanks released a report warning the EU over China's increasing political influence in the region. What are the key concerns and how can they be addressed? Welcome to The Point, live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. On Sunday, China's Commerce Ministry announced it would launch an investigation into claims that the United States has subsidized sorghum farmers, allowing them to sell into China at a loss. More than 3/4 of the sorghum the U.S. exports goes to China, and the results of this investigation could deal a significant blow to U.S. farmers. Less than 2 weeks ago, U.S. President Donald Trump imposed tariffs on imports of solar panels and washing machines, partly from China. Is this sorghum probe the latest move in trade frictions between the world's two biggest economies? Where are things heading next? I'm joined in the studio by Mr. He Weiwen, Senior Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, and Tim Stratford, Managing Partner of Covington and Burling LLP, Beijing, and also a former Assistant Trade Representative for the U.S. government. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Now, sorghum is, for those who don't know what it is a type of a grain that mostly used in China to feed livestock. You can also make liquor out of it. Now, as I said, the U.S. is the world's largest exporter of sorghum. Yearly volume would be about 4.8 million tons to China, and accounting for about $1 billion. So, Mr. Stratford, how do you see this measure of investigation into sorghum exports to China?
The business community here has heard for a long time that China has been looking at the rhetoric coming from the Trump administration and waiting to see what actions would actually be taken. And we've heard in a lot of different circles that China was preparing to retaliate if the U.S. government actually took certain steps. And it seems that this may be a first step in that effort. The fact that the investigation was self-initiated is a very unusual step. Usually you have a petitioner that asks the government to do this type of investigation. But I think this is the first time that MOFCOM has ever self-initiated an investigation, which sends, I think, a very strong signal to the United States.
Do people understand why sorghum is the target?
I think, of course, we can't read people's minds, but it seems that it's a measured response, and it seems that it could well be directed to people that have been part of the president's base. So it seems that it was a very well thought through step for the Chinese side to take.
Mr. He, I know, of course, China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and China's Ministry of Commerce have all said that this is an individual investigation, not in any way a retaliative measure. However, as what we've heard, it is difficult for people not to make that kind of connection, that kind of speculation. Exactly what is China trying to do here? Is this a retaliation?
I think both. Yeah, first of all, it is an individual case. Whether there was a trade tariffs on the solar panel and washing machines from the Trump administration, this case will be taken in China on sorghum sooner or later.
Why?
So, yeah, because the imports, the quantities are growing fast with the price coming down. So enough to justify the government intervention. So this is the Chinese Ministry of Commerce took the initiative to launch the case without any suing from the companies. But this is similar to the case in the USTR a few weeks ago, a few months ago, on the aluminum alloy panels, also self-initiated by our Department of Commerce.
Yeah, but you say it is also kind of retaliatory message.
No, and first, it's normal. Yeah, sooner or later it would happen, no matter there is a case from the solar panel, from washing machine from in the U.S. or not. This will happen. That's first. Second, due to the time relations, so people used to tend to think this is tit for tat. It gives people some impression, but I should say that the original meaning is individual case. And the second point is, I don't think this is a trade war, because this is individual cases. And if you count the sorghum case with a volume of $1 billion accounts for less than 1% of U.S. exports to China. And the U.S. cases on China with a volume of less than 2% of China exports to the U.S. So it's not trade war. I don't agree with Wilbur Ross' claims. He said at Davos that the trade war happened every day. It's not trade war.
Could this be a warning sign that China is sending to the United States?
Yes,
if so,
definitely.
What is the message? What does China want the U.S. to hear?
We say that we also have tools. Don't forget that we are at your you cannot do what you like on China. China could also do the same. However, all the behaviors should be based on WTO rules. We cannot abuse any tools.
Mr. Stratford, how do you look at the turn of events now? It seems that China is also taking quite a tough stance, saying, although we have been urging consultation, dialogue, but look, if you really insist on going to a confrontational route, we are ready to stand guard, in guard of our interests.
I understand why China has done this, but it seems to me that we need to step back and look at the underlying issue.
Both? You mean both sides, or?
Both sides. Both sides. I think that the U.S. government has been concerned about China's economic development model. Some people refer to it as state capitalism. And there's now a pretty strong consensus in the United States, not about what to do about it, but that the fact that China's economic development model has developed in the way it has creates fundamental problems. The USTR's report on China issued in January even went so far as to say that the United States made a mistake in supporting China's entry into the WTO on terms that didn't assure that China would develop into more of a market economy. So if that's the underlying problem, the U.S. taking trade actions against panels or washing machines or steel or aluminum is not going to solve the underlying problem. And China taking countermeasures to remind the United States that there will be costs on both sides won't really solve the problem either. I think what's necessary is for the two governments to look at the underlying problem and say, how are we going to deal with the real underlying issues?
Mr. He, how do you look at the kind of underlying issues Mr. Stratford has been highlighting?
Yes, I think this is a fundamental issue we have to address. The problem between the United States and China is beyond the trade imbalance and the individual cases of trade remedies. Because if we add all the trade remedies cases together, they amount to a few percentage points of the whole trade volume between the two countries. And this will not solve the trade issues between the two countries. We have to address first, China must and needs to open further and to follow WTO rules, especially to offer equal treatment to foreign companies in China regarding Made in China 2025. All the supports, measures, privileges applying to Chinese companies should be applied equally to foreign companies to help release the worry of the China.
Are there promise and efforts underway from the Chinese government?
Both President Xi Jinping and Premier Li Keqiang has repeatedly reiterated this position.
Is this going to be carried out, do you think?
So what we need to do is to make it a fact that we have to have good cases showing that it's equal, open for foreign companies.
Right.
I think this is maybe more important than the trade issues.
But
of course, trade issues are also important. We have to deal with them carefully.
Right, but at this moment, with President Trump repeatedly talking about trade imbalances, especially saying trade deficits is the cause of the loss of jobs in the United States, the cause of, or the fault of previous U.S. administration, I don't think there is the right atmosphere to address the fundamental issues that we're faced with. Mr. Stratford.
Part of the problem is, I agree with Professor He about the problem, and part of the problem is that the foreign business community and also foreign governments have heard Chinese assurances about foreign companies being treated equally for a number of years now. And because the companies don't believe the situation has changed, they've become rather skeptical about promises. So Professor He is exactly right. We need to figure out what kind of actions can be taken that can demonstrate that we're entering into a new era.
And Professor He?
And I don't think trade balance is a top concern of the bilateral trade relations, because you see, if we look at the data last year, 2017, the U.S. global goods deficit, trade deficit, even grew, hit a 9-year high, expanded by nearly $60 billion. Although President Trump spent his efforts, utmost efforts, to bring down the deficit, it didn't happen. On the contrary, although the trade deficit hit the 9-year high, the jobless rate in the U.S. hit more than 10 years low. So that means there's no relationship between the deficit growth and the job losses. So it is important. My recommendation is President Donald Trump and his team rethink about the trade balance issue. We should focus on more important issues.
Mr. Stratford, how do you look at the relationship between trade deficit and the apparent opposite direction of job figures?
I think that most prominent economists in the United States would agree with what Professor He said, that a trade balance in and of itself is not a complete picture, and that if you just focus on that, you might be led to take measures, in fact, that would hurt the economy and hurt the job situation. So I think it's probably the case that if some of the openness questions that we talked about were addressed, that would help to have more manufacturing jobs in the United States, and it would affect the trade deficit to a certain extent. But I think if we just focus on the trade deficit, that would be quite a misleading indicator.
Well, we will wait and see what kind of further reforms will be carried out to give foreign companies greater access. We have to leave it there. Many thanks to my two guests, Professor He Weiwen, Senior Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, and Mr. Tim Stratford, Managing Partner of Covington and Burling LLP Beijing office. And you have been watching The Point with me, Liu Xin. We'll take a short break and we'll be back right after that. Stay with us. On Monday, two Berlin-based think tanks, the Global Public Policy Institute and the Mercator Institute for China Studies, co-released a report drawing attention to what it calls Beijing's growing political influence over business, politics and media in the EU, following the high-profile state visits to China from both French President Emmanuel Macron and British Prime Minister Theresa May just since the beginning of this year. The report warns that the EU may be too easily embracing Chinese influence at the risk of contradicting European values and interests. The report warns that all areas of Europe's interaction with China have strong political undertones and proposed a series of suggestions on how to counter Beijing's so-called divide and rule tactics. With China-EU Comprehensive Strategic Partnership moving into its 15th year, how should we look at the structural changes that EU-China ties are undergoing, and what can be done on both sides to strengthen mutually beneficial cooperation? Joining me for the discussion are Thorsten Benner, co-founder and director of the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin, and also a co-writer of the report, and here in Beijing, Dr. Zhao Hai from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Mr. Benner, let me ask you first. Now, this report is titled Authoritarian Advance, Responding to China's Growing Political Influence in Europe. Could you please tell us the main ideas behind the composition of this report, and how did you come to your conclusion?
I mean, the main idea is that China, or the Communist Party and its state organs, have been extremely successful at furthering their interests in Europe. So it's very complementary of what the Chinese Communist Party has done over the past years. We argue that China has been taking advantage of the one-sided openness of Europe to Chinese money, to Chinese ideas and to Chinese actors. And we detail how, through investment, the Chinese Communist Party and its organs are building leverage in Europe, how they try to influence the narrative on China. President Xi has said, like, tell this China story well, and they try to enlist think tanks, media, also academics to tell a version of the China story that is in the interest of the Communist Party. So we're very complimentary of the efforts of the Chinese state to build influence and leverage in Europe, something that also other countries have been doing. But since China has a political system and political philosophy that's authoritarian, as we call it, and different from the liberal democracies of Europe, this is something that should concern Europeans, and we call for a more kind of sober approach, taking stock of the success of China and responding not in kind. We don't respond, we don't suggest that Europe should reciprocate and have the exact same controls on foreign ideas and foreign capital and foreign actors that China has been imposing for a long time. But we want more transparency and openness about the kind of payments China is making to enlist European companies, European professionals to further their interests, what kind of contracts are being made with universities that establish Confucius Institutes. We just want to know more, and Europeans should also invest across the board in kind of independent reporting and analysis on China, so we understand what's going on and what the agenda of the Chinese state that has been very successful over the past years and its organs.
So could you please explain, how did you do your research? For instance, how many companies, how many institutions, how many think tanks have you talked to, how many people have you interviewed? So the method of how you came to this conclusion.
The method is very simple. We just compiled what's out there in the public domain. We're not talking about sinister things. We're just compiling how many investments China has been doing and to what degree they've led to political leverage. We're drawing a connection between, for example, how the Hungarian government has been torpedoing a joint statement of the European Union on China's actions in the South China Sea, how Greece, the Greek government, after it received a major investment for the port of Piraeus, all at once decided to block a joint European Union resolution in the Human Rights Council that would have been critical of China's human rights record.
Right.
So we're
just
connecting the dots that are out there. And
okay, I understand your point. Okay. Dr. Zhao, let me ask you, first of all, not thinking of the details, but the kind of sentiment as reflected, the sense of insecurity and great unease, maybe, about China's influence in Europe. What do you think of that?
Well, first of all, I think we should thank Dr. Banner to compose this report, and I know how difficult it is to write this kind of report, 50 pages long. I don't even have time to read through all the reports, but also I think it's important for us to understand our counterparts in Europe, what they think, and what they think particularly about China's influence. Our institute, CAS, actually was mentioned in the report, and from my personal perspective, I don't know about others' response to this, but I think CAS has no such influence as mentioned in the report, and we certainly didn't co-op any think tanks or universities or media in Europe just advancing China's interest and at the same time threaten European Union's interest. So I think overall, looking at the report, on the one hand, we recognize there's a rising China with rising influence in Europe, but on the other hand, whether or not that kind of influence is detrimental to EU interests and also making it more dangerous to European activities overall, I think that's questionable.
Well, the report says the Chinese leadership's political influence seeking in Europe is driven by two interlocked motivations. First and foremost, it seeks to secure regime stability, so-called regime stability at home, and second, it is, or Beijing aims to present its political concepts as a competitive and ultimately superior political and economic model. Mr. Banner, what's the basis of such a conclusion?
You just read President Xi's statement that is not exactly a secret in the recently elevated President Xi political thought. that the Chinese Communist Party has an absolute claim to power that is uncontestable, and is also not exactly a secret. In the speech that President Xi gave to the recent party crawlers, it talked about blazing a trail for other countries, that China is an attractive and very successful model. So we're just taking President Xi's statements also on kind of telling the China story well. Also the long-established united front philosophy behind a lot of activities that informs what the Chinese Communist Party and its organs are doing. We're just taking them at face value. That's
well,
as simple as that.
I think
nothing much to that.
I think you used interpretation instead of the original quotes. China, by the way, the Chinese government never used the term China model, and China has made it very clear that it's not exporting any Chinese model, anything. But Dr. Zhao...
It's blazing a trail, as Mr. Xi said.
But it never said exporting a Chinese model, as you have interpreted in your report. Dr. Zhao, does China need stronger political influence in Europe for its so-called regime stability at home?
No, I really don't think so. I think what China wants in Europe is, China has specifically talked about this for a long time. China wants a multipolar world. China does not want any country to dominate the world, and China believes European Union can be a very good partner in global affairs. For instance, when the United States quit climate change, the Paris Accord, China actually worked together with European unions to maintain this stability and try to maintain the common ground on protecting the earth. And also, I think China sees in Europe a good trading partner and also promoting cultural and other exchanges. So expanding political influence in Europe does not mean that China wants to divide Europe. Actually, China wants to have a unified Europe to stand up against other intentions in the world to try to dominate the world. So I think overall we have to recognize China's good intention in Europe, and I also think that it's because of Europeans' decreasing self-confidence that actually contributed to this kind of concern and even paranoia. I think China is not actually promoting this kind of ideas, and to that confidence, to promote so-called China model and preach that in European countries.
Mr. Benner, let me ask you this question. The report comes across as depicting China-EU relations as harmful to Europe's interests. So what does a healthy China-EU relationship should look like for you? You stress the ideological difference, but you have to understand China is not going to change its political system into a Western-style liberal democracy. If this is the prerequisite for China-EU relationship, then this is a dead-end street.
Exactly, and yeah. No, exactly. Our report exactly assumes the opposite. Not a single recommendation or demand we make concerns what China should do. We assume that it's very rational on the part of the Chinese Communist Party not to change its model, but rather to double down on the authoritarian state capitalism that President Xi has been pursuing, because it has been doing very well for him and the Communist Party. So we're thinking about how a sober relationship and a realistic relationship between the EU and China should look like, in terms of that we take stock and we know about the channels of influence that China has established, that we make our publics aware of this. That doesn't mean, and it also means that if necessary, we are able to block foreign investments if they hurt European interests. Measures like this, we wouldn't allow Chinese funding or other foreign funding for political parties. There's a few things we would need to change. But at the same time, of course, a healthy European-China relationship includes exchanges between European countries and the European Union, and Chinese citizens, people-to-people exchanges should be promoted. It also, of course, includes working together on common challenges such as climate change. We don't doubt that at all. But at the same time, we assume that China will stick to its model, and Europe needs to live up to this reality, because for a long time Europeans have kind of had this illusion that China would become more open, more like us, if you will. That illusion is now long gone. Hopefully, European policymakers and the European public wakes up to this new reality and builds a more realistic European Union-China relationship.
Well, I don't think China need to look like anybody. But anyway, Dr. Zhao, how should China address the legitimate concerns that have been reflected by our European counterparts, including government, businesses, think tanks, etc.?
Well, I think first and foremost is that China should stick to its open and reform policy. And I think one of the concerns, bigger concerns from the Europeans and also the Americans, Australians, is that China will not stick to its open and reform policy anymore. But actually, China is still a developing country, is still in the process of reforming itself. So I don't think our European partners or European friends should label China as if China has stopped progressing. And also, on the other hand, I think it's important for us, both European countries and China, should actually accelerate people-to-people exchanges, and we should talk more and communicate more to understand each other's positions. And with that, I think that will reduce the paranoia and hysteria in European countries.
We're running out of time. But it is going to take time for us to enhance our understanding. Many thanks to my two guests, Mr. Thorsten Benner, I appreciate it, co-founder and director of the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin, and Dr. Zhao Hai from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. My last point here, it is understandable that with the change of economic weight and the internal challenges Europe is faced with, Europe-China ties are being re-examined. On the one hand, China needs to address the concerns about China's intentions and provide greater access to foreign businesses through deeper reforms. On the other hand, Europe also needs to take off the ideological glasses it has been putting on when it comes to viewing China. China seeks understanding and respect of its development path. It does not seek to export it. Nor will China benefit from Europe's ills, because in an interconnected world, nobody can thrive on its own. The report says Europe neglects China's increasing influence at its own peril. I would say Europe risks misreading China to its detriment. That's all for this edition of The Point. Follow me on Facebook or Twitter using the handle The Point with Alex. Download the application called CGTN to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. We've got The Point.